common misconception. I'm really looking forward to today's session. It's focusing on governance. We're talking about the pitfalls, the difficulties, the advantages of the system of governance that we have for charities and the newer form of community interest companies. Rather than having people sort of doing a lecture and then having questions, we're going to do it as an interview because we find that's more lively, really, particularly for the online format. Do use the chat to ask any questions. In fact, as the session goes through, just to jot down the questions that spring to your mind. And I might come to you and ask you to put the question yourself, or depending on time, I might put the question on your behalf to our two speakers. So I'll introduce the speakers. First of all, Mona Bani is the founder and managing director of Revoke Community Interest Company. She's the child of political refugees, grew up in Denmark and migrated to the UK. Many people would be thinking of migrating the other way at the moment, but we're very pleased to have her with us. She's done all sorts of interesting things, working with think tanks, schools, charities, and indeed including the refugee camps in Calais. Revoke, which I've mentioned, is a grassroots organisation which advocates for the rights and welfare of young refugees. And I do think that in the current political climate, advocating for the rights of refugees is astonishingly important because they are so under threat and subject to negative publicity and negative comments from the political classes, some of them. Mona also runs a media channel called Untelevised, which explores the possibilities for social change. So really rounded set of experience there. And Sarah Loader, who's also with us, works with us at Campbell Tickell as a consultant, working largely on governance in the charity sector, sports bodies, the public sector. And she too has had a very varied and interesting career, including, wait for it, 15 years at the Charity Commission, who we love and we love to hate sometimes. She was a senior advisor in the charity engagement team and has produced guidance for charities on governance issues. She has an MA in voluntary sector studies and has also got various qualifications and a background as a trustee. So those are our two speakers. And I'm going to start off with some questions to get the discussion going. Mona, I'm going to start with you actually, because we've mentioned charities and community interest companies, and Revoke is actually a community interest company, which is a newer form of incorporation, quite different from the traditional charity format. And I think it's fair to say the charity format goes back to the Victorian era, when the great and the good did great things for the wretched and the poor. So it's the model we have, but it's quite an old-fashioned model as well. So you have the trustees and the staff, and they're quite separate. So Mona, what are the advantages and disadvantages of being a community interest company and a charity, just so we can get those two streams of thought for the meeting?
So I mean, a community interest company, I guess, in the kind of simplest form of describing it, is that it is a lot simpler. Like, it does involve a lot less bureaucracy. It is a lot simpler to set up, and I guess maybe to kind of govern day to day. I guess in very practical terms, you register with Companies House as opposed to the Charities Commission, and you file like annual accounts and stuff with Companies House. You are liable for corporation tax on anything that's still considered profit, but given that we are a non-profit and you essentially make yourself a company limited by guarantee, and you kind of state in your articles of association what that is, our income in our case is all still from charitable foundations and it's donations, so it's not profit. And so that's kind of quite a key thing to be aware of when you do your accounts, so you don't end up paying tax on money that's essentially like donated to you for very specific purposes, as opposed to profit the directors would pocket. We set it up that way because it is a less bureaucratic process, because it allows you to be much more involved, you know, as a director in the kind of governance and the day-to-day, and that you kind of can move a lot more quickly and it's a bit more nimble, and, you know, especially when we're dealing with such like kind of urgent issues that are just like constantly like changing and evolving, and you need as a director to be able to make quite quick decisions and kind of be close to the ground. It is a format that works certainly better for us. And I was previously co-director of another CIC, and that was the same kind of logic there. I mean, you said pros and cons. I guess so a con I just mentioned is that if you're, you know, people are less familiar with CICs, and we do find that we found it difficult to, for example, just find like an accountant that understood CICs, and from a financial perspective that has been tricky, like making sure that we didn't end up having to pay corporation tax, and that people understood the way that we needed to file our accounts. Some charitable foundations, like older ones, have not updated yet, so if you're a CIC you can't apply for all of them, so there are still some programs that you wouldn't be able to get money from, so I guess that's a con. And I guess we are getting a bit more into the governance side later, but, you know, you could argue potentially that there could be less accountability in some cases. On the other hand, I guess the cons, at least for us in a charity structure, was that slightly maybe more old-fashioned nature that you mentioned, that we don't feel it's as applicable to how we work now, and that it is a much more bureaucratic process to kind of set up and to govern. I would probably say those are like the headlines from me.
Great, thank you for starting us off, Mona. Sarah, so the question about the bureaucracy of setting up a charity, do you think that's fair enough? Is it a bit of a palaver?
Well, yes, probably it is. I mean, there is a lot of guidance out there, and it's probably much more straightforward if you're a smaller organisation. But it is more structured and it is more regulated. And I think Mona has covered some of the sort of like key issues around the differences. I mean, I think in order to set up as a charity, if you're small and you come under a certain income level of £5,000, you wouldn't have to register. If you go above that level, then you do have to register, but you can do it without sort of like having to go through lots of legal advice. There are sort of reasonably straightforward processes you can use. The Charity Commission has standard documentation, and if you can get through their website and use it, it does give you a step-by-step process in how you actually register as a charity. Yes, there is bureaucracy involved in registering as a charity, and obviously once you're registered, there are certain sort of legal requirements on you once you are registered to keep the register up to date, and depending on how big you are, sort of providing accounts to the Charity Commission and reporting on any serious incidents. So there is a level of bureaucracy, because obviously if you have tax breaks, then you would expect to have to answer to the regulator, which answers to the public. Mm-hmm. So,
and we heard from Mona that some of the big charitable trusts are reluctant to give grants to community interest companies. I mean, I suspect some of them may never get around to that. I'm not sure. What's your view?
I think that there is an element of being a charity is a known concept, and there is a long history. I mean, I think you talked about the Victorian age and charities working in the Victorian age, but the concept of charity goes back much further than that. And I think it's something which is sort of part of the tradition, and people have it in their minds, and there is an element of trust in that as a format. And there is a central regulator in the Charity Commission. And I think trusts, when they're giving money, haven't always got the time to really go in depth to make sure that each organisation is set up as they would want them to be set up. And so having sort of a registered charity is almost like a badge of saying you've gone through some processes, so we have some confidence that you are set up properly and that you are regulated in some way. And whether that's right or not, I think that there will always be certain funders who will fall back on that because it is comfortable and a known concept.
And Mona, I've heard it said that the community interest companies are pretty much unregulated, actually, certainly compared to charities. And there's no kind of serious incident reporting. There's no kind of regulator making sure that they stick to their purpose. Do you think that's a fair characterization? Is it an unregulated space?
It probably is. I mean, having never actually governed a charity, it's hard for me to actually make the comparison, but yeah, fairly. So in terms of kind of reporting, we file accounts every year that are public and, viewable by the public. We have to file a very simple form that goes with that just kind of states what activities we did that year with that money. But I've certainly never in the 5-6 years of directing a CIC had anybody come and actually sort of, I don't know, say they're going to check that, or that they're going to visit, or that they're going to randomly audit you or anything. I certainly haven't experienced it. It could be that it might get done, maybe if you're bigger. You can be as little as 2 directors, I believe, to run a CIC. Now, there are a lot of, especially again, charitable foundations who want you to be 3 as a minimum. And I think that is, again, to avoid, maybe like gridlock in decision making, or so you at least have slightly more like people that have to vote on something before decisions are made. But you can be just 2 directors, and then yes, that is as high, that is as high up as it can go. Like, we've chosen to have a sort of voluntary chair of directors in our case, who's like almost a bit like an advisory board member who has a lot of experience in this sector, and therefore has kind of offered to almost like, almost be the person that does like the performance reviews with us that I would do with my staff, for example. But otherwise, yeah, I think you could get away with not even having that. Yeah.
And so, Sarah, looking at the charity format, if there was a founder who'd set something up, as Mona has done, they probably couldn't be a trustee, could they?
You could be. Generally, trustees of charities aren't paid. So if you wanted to be a founder who also got paid for the work that you do, generally it would be more difficult, although not impossible, to sit on the board. But it is difficult when you have a founder who's also on the board. It's fine because you've got that enthusiasm and you've got someone who passionately cares about the organisation, and that is wonderful. And you can't replace that kind of enthusiasm and that commitment. I think what sometimes happens, and it doesn't always happen, is that if you do have a founder who is on the board, as the organisation grows and changes and perhaps goes in different directions, you might have someone who is very wedded to how it was when it's set up, and perhaps not feel as comfortable with an organisation changing direction, or perhaps taking different decisions about where money should go or who should be helped. And that can lead to tensions. It doesn't always, it depends on the personalities, I think. But I mean, I think having a founder on a board just everyone needs to be aware of the risks that there are with doing that. It's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just an awareness that things will grow and change. And when you've got more people involved in the decision making, the founder won't always have control over the direction in which things go. So
if you have a charity, in effect, you have to have a number of trustees, sort of non-executive directors.
Yes.
And if you're setting up a grassroots, perhaps community-based organisation with roots in a particular refugee community, it's a bit of a tall order, isn't it, to get people who have that community, that sensitivity to the community, and are prepared to serve, and yet wouldn't be involved in the direct operations of the charity. How do you think organisations go about finding trustees when they're just setting themselves up?
Are you asking me or Mona?
Yeah, no, I was going to ask Mona the same question in a moment.
Well, I think all organisations, all charities, apart from the very big ones, probably do find it a struggle to find people who are willing to serve on boards, particularly with charities, because you do have legal responsibilities, and along with those responsibilities, comes the potential for liability, which, although rare, is something where if people take seriously the role, they need to be aware that there are risks in taking on that role, that you are responsible for the organisation. So it is difficult, but I think that there are various ways to find people who would serve. I mean, a lot of charities do look to people in the communities that they serve to actually come onto the board. And I think what's important is if you do that, you give people the support and the training and the help and the advice to make sure that they're comfortable in that role. So I think it is a good idea for organisations to hear those voices at decision-making level. So there's nothing wrong with actually going to people who are within the community that an organisation serves to ask them if they will serve on the board. But there are other ways of finding people. I mean, there are organisations set up, for example, NCVO has set up a free service where you can match with people who are interested in volunteering opportunities, including at board level. You can advertise, you can also look to other voluntary organisations sort of who work in your field to see if there are people that they know. But I think what's important is to be as open as possible when you're looking for people, to try and get as wide a field as possible of people so that you can get people with the right skills and who are willing to learn to understand the responsibilities and are really willing to take on the time commitment, because it can be a time-consuming thing, and it's important people are aware at the start what that time commitment is. But I think there are ways and means of finding people who will volunteer, and I think as long as they know that they'll be supported in that role and that the organisation will help them to learn the responsibilities that they have, you can find people who will be willing to serve. And there are organisations who will match you with people who are looking for opportunities.
That's really positive. Mona, I think you mentioned before the session started that you might be extending the size of your board to get more non-executive directors. How do you think you're going to approach that task of finding people who are sympathetic, experienced, and sensitive to the needs of the communities that you're serving?
Yeah, it's something that we've been speaking about quite a bit, and that we feel would be really good for us, and that, especially maybe from a kind of advisory perspective, so you have a wider, broad, range of people to draw upon who might have, immigration expertise, legal expertise, and so on, so that you also don't maybe have to constantly go and kind of pay for that sort of thing if you need just like a little bit of input from time to time. In our case, we are fortunate, myself and my co-directors, that we've perhaps worked in various fields for a long time, and so our network is quite vast, and people sort of care and they're interested and they want to help. And so we've actually had people maybe even come forward and say to us, this is so great and you've set this up and I'd like to be involved somehow. And sometimes they specifically can't be involved as staff because that's not the level of time they have and it's not the level of money that we have. So that actually it fits much better to say, do you want to be a sort of non-executive director, essentially a bit like a sort of advisory board member? Which I think speaks a lot to what you were saying before, that if organizations are new, and especially maybe if they kind of get built out of the communities that they serve, that sometimes those networks might be lacking, or sometimes the types of people that understand the issue really well and are affected by it, people speak about it now as having lived experience of it, might not be able to kind of work for free, and they might not be in a position to be able to give that much time. And I think traditionally trustees have perhaps a bit more been people who have had quite a long career already, and now they kind of want to give something back and they don't need the money as much, and they might be winding down in their sort of other work. And obviously that's perfect, but that won't necessarily be the case with kind of people who are still deeply affected by the issues that they're working on. And I think this is where it gets difficult, and I think this is where that category is a tricky one, and kind of how much you should go for lived experience for an understanding of your cause versus actually people who are really deeply entrenched in lived experience, maybe not physically having the ability or the headspace or the time or the finances to do it. So we are quite fortunate that we have got quite a wide and interesting range of people who I feel have enough understanding and empathy of the cause, but who also have maybe the professional experience to offer, who kind of want to help us. And I think from our perspective, it's more about, we're more wanting to work out, what does it look like? You know, like, what are we asking of those people? Are we asking them to meet once a month? Are we asking them to, you know, sometimes do odd pieces of work? Are we asking them just to be at the end of a phone? Like, I think it's actually for us more than it to work out what we want it to be, and how, if we're choosing them, they somehow still come in and kind of hold us to account, but we're telling them how to do that. You know, that's the kind of funny balance of it as well.
Because you're choosing your own boss, in effect.
Yeah, basically. So the guy I've asked to be the chair of us, you know, the chair of us, he actually was my first ever manager in my first job in the charity sector. He kind of hired me, he like trained me up, he got me my secondment into the cabinet office. So he's kind of followed my career as a kind of mentor, and literally is someone now who doesn't need the money, and, you know, who's kind of winding down a little bit in his executive jobs. And when I set this up, he said I'd be kind of honored to do it. But again, you have to know someone like that. And I know someone like that because I worked in that environment for a while. But yeah, so I'm choosing him to be my boss, basically.
That's good. So Sarah, you mentioned about the liabilities of trustees. I think this is a really important point, because when you ask people to become a trustee, I've heard it said that it is the most onerous set of responsibilities that exists in terms of the law, because I think I've heard it said that the duty of a trustee is to treat the charity's property with the same care as if it were their own.
Yes.
Which is more onerous than that for a company director. So we're asking quite a lot of people, aren't we? Do you think people are going to be put off? Tell us a bit about the responsibilities.
Well, there are some, yes, there are quite onerous responsibilities. I mean, I think in terms of liability, I'll run through the kind of legal responsibilities that you have. I mean, to start with, each charity is set up with what we call a governing document. So that might be your articles of association or set of rules. And a board of trustees has to ensure that the organisation, the charity, complies with that governing document. So it's got to meet all of the requirements in that. And they're often 20 odd pages of requirements of how you run the organisation. But in particular, the board has to make sure that the charity actually complies with the purposes, the charitable purposes set out. And that sounds quite simple, but sometimes it's more difficult in practice. You have some legal wording which sets out what you're supposed to do, and you've got to interpret that and make sure that you're doing what it is you wanted to do when you set up, and the activities all fit with that. So you've got to make sure that you comply with all of the administrative requirements, and you've also got to make sure that you always use the money within the charitable purposes. You've got to often, as Mona pointed out, as a trustee, you're unpaid usually. So you're doing all this free of charge. But you've also got to make sure that you don't have any particular conflicts of interest. So you've got to make sure you put the interests of the organisation first. So if you were, say, someone who needed to be paid for some aspect of the work that you were doing for the charity, you have to be very careful as to whether or not that's allowed. You have to act with reasonable care and skill, and that's quite a broad-ranging kind of phrase. But basically, you've got to make sure that you understand all of the legal responsibilities of being a charity trustee, and they are quite wide-ranging in terms of sort of making sure that you approve budgets and that you make sure that the money is used properly. You make sure that any of the people that you work with are kept safe, that there's proper safeguarding, that you ensure that sort of any risk to the organisation is mitigated in terms of things like, for example, computer viruses, and making sure that you keep all people's data safe. So it is quite wide-ranging because you are basically running an organisation. So yes, I can understand that people can be put off by that, but there is lots of advice and guidance. And what the Charity Commission has tended to say in terms of liability is that as long as you've acted reasonably and honestly, the Charity Commission and the courts would accept that you have done your best and therefore not hold you liable. But liability is a difficult issue, and I'm not a lawyer, but there are all sorts of ways that you can mitigate any kind of risks. For example, Mona says that, that they're set up as a company, and obviously setting up as a company does limit your liability to third parties. So there's lots of ways that you can mitigate any of the risks, and you can also, your charity can take out trustee liability insurance, which can help mitigate against any calls upon you personally. But that's not to lessen the responsibilities that you face as a trustee, and I think it can be quite off-putting for people.
So a trustee who didn't go to many meetings and didn't read the papers and didn't ask questions, they might be a risk, mightn't they? Because no insurance policy would cover you if you weren't taking your duties seriously.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's where when you first join a board, it's very important to have a proper induction, which points out to you that you need to be sure that you have read the papers, that you know what's going on within the organisation, that when the staff report to you, you look at it and you say, I might not understand every single detail, but I can ask a question about it. And as long as you do that, as long as you're inquiring and you keep up to date with things, that's very important. But you're right, if you miss lots of meetings and you sort of absent yourself from the whole process, then you're putting yourself in a risky position because you're not actually taking part in any of the decision making.
Indeed. And Mona, I guess it's not that different for a company director of a CIC.
Oh, definitely. I think we have the same liabilities, and I know that we had this sort of discussion. So actually Revoke came out of the fact that I was a co-director of another CIC where I wasn't the founder, and actually we had some of the difficulties that Sarah alluded to earlier with having a founder who still is a kind of executive director, and the organization had grown in ways that he wasn't completely okay with, and so we had actually like a mediated process, but we were supported by external mediation. So that's perhaps one way as well that you can kind of hold yourselves to account. We were 3 directors, and in the end, myself and the third director decided that we would set up Revoke, and we actually went to some of our funders and said, we're going to still deliver these elements of the work, and the founder wants to slightly scale back what the organization has become. Would you be willing to recontract these funding contracts to a new CIC, knowing that we're still in charge? Which they did. So we started Revoke, but with a bit of a sort of leg up from the get-go, rather than having to start completely from scratch. But so that was one of those issues, and so we went for external mediation to help us, kind of do that well. And so, yeah, in that process, we all had to be very aware of our potential kind of the way that we were liable, including the fact that myself and my co-director were stepping off the company halfway through the year, meaning that the year's accounts would in theory be filed after we'd left, and our names would still be on them. And if any kind of financial misconduct then happened after we left, we could potentially still be held liable because our names were sort of on them for part of that year. So we sort of had to sign off everything and sign off where the money had been when we stepped off, and so on. So, and then now coming and setting up Revoke as just 2 directors, we again knew that it was good practice to have 3. And it wasn't the easiest to be like, who is that third person? Like, even if you really reassure them that they don't have to do much, it took us a while before we found somebody that was willing to kind of take that on for us for exactly all these reasons. Kind of felt a bit nervous about it. Now, one thing you can do as directors, and I'll be honest, I don't fully myself understand whether it's kind of token or whether it's a bit more real, is that you can, first of all, be a director, but with no significant control in a CIC. It's something you select on the company's house registration. You can say that you have significant control or that you don't have significant control. You can also give voting percentage. So you could actually say that a third director has no voting rights and 2 of them do. I don't know why somebody would almost want to take that on and not have voting rights, but you can say that. So you can put degrees of responsibility in, but no one I've asked really knows what that gets you off the hook on, and at one point being a director is still being a director. So actually, Sarah, if you know, I'd be interested to know, because I'm finding that it's such a new concept that you ask people and they're not quite sure.
I would think if you weren't voting, you weren't a director.
I would have thought
Actually,
so too, but apparently you can be.
Sarah, it's not unknown, of course, for personal liability to be upheld against trustees. It may be very, very rare, but it has happened a few times, hasn't it?
It has happened, but I mean, usually it would be in quite extreme circumstances where I suspect the courts or the Charity Commission would have held that someone had acted really, really badly and hadn't taken their responsibilities at all seriously, or they'd acted illegally, or they'd been. So it is very rare, and I think everyone sort of understands that with the kind of position that a lot of people are in, where they're unremunerated, that as long as they are doing their best and they're getting advice when they need it, that they don't have to know every little thing about the legal responsibilities. But it is quite rare. I mean, I know the big case about sort of liability is around Kids Company, and that has been subject to sort of like people saying whether or not the trustees acted unlawfully or not, and it is a matter of opinion, and the courts suggested that there are in certain circumstances, despite the fact that they perhaps didn't have the oversight that they should have done, that they wouldn't be found personally liable. So it's a difficult one, and I think most of the time, as long as people act honestly and with the best intentions, they would generally not be found liable.
Yes. What's to be done, Sarah, if you have a trustee who's simply not performing? Yes, somebody who's joined the board apparently with the best of intentions, but actually they're not reading the papers, they're not asking sensible questions at meetings, they're just not really doing their job. What can a charity do about that?
I mean, it is quite difficult, because often people are appointed for a set term. So you might have someone appointed for 3 years. And what charities can do, and what a lot of charities will do, is that the chair will have sort of annual chats with individual trustees to find out how they're finding being on the board and what their position is. But it's also an opportunity for the chair of the charity to say, look, we've noticed that you're not really reading the papers. Is there an issue with this? We think that perhaps this isn't working out as well as it could. It's difficult because it has to be managed very sensitively. But often, if you've got some kind of annual appraisal process, that it's usually the chair can have a quiet word and hopefully sort of come to some kind of agreement that person might step down if they're not prepared to put the effort into it.
Mm-hmm. And I know of at least one charity where the chair holds signed but undated letters of resignation from every trustee. That's slightly extreme, isn't it?
I've not heard of that, but that is
okay.
That is quite well. That's one way of doing it, I suppose.
Let's talk about challenge a bit, because the role of a company director, or indeed of a trustee, is to challenge the paid staff, which might include the founder, of course. What does good challenge look like? Mona, let me start with you. Do you get challenged as the founder and as a board member?
I mean, so this was kind of the idea behind bringing in this like chair, and like I said, having literally worked with this person before as my manager, I felt like actually he would be in quite a good position to do that with me. So yeah, so I think this is, I guess, also a really key thing with us as directors, is that we're also paid staff, but we are paid only for the work that we do. So unlike, I guess, if you're a director of a for-profit company, I guess you can do whatever, you take whatever profit your company makes, and it doesn't have to necessarily be, in line with what hours you've given. But for us, we're directors, yes, but essentially we have duties, and our pay is based on, just like all the other staff, pro rata, the days that we work. We happen at Revoke to have a flat pay structure, so we pay everyone the same, regardless of whether they're directors or not. But of course we have a hierarchy of responsibilities, so people report to me. But yeah, so I would hold my staff to account, and then now I would be held to account, I guess, by my co-director as well, but by this guy that has come in as our chair. And I mean, we do work in a very, very close and non-hierarchical fashion, so I would like to think, my team do raise things with me if they want them to be different, and we have a team meeting every week that everybody's part of. I chair it, but everyone's part of it, where they have and can say to me, I actually don't agree with this, or I think we should do it this way, and then we aim to work with consensus decision making to reach decisions. And only when it maybe becomes, for example, a financial or more legal issue, would myself or my co-director have a final say. But we're still only a team of 5 core staff, so that's doable. And we're mindful of how that might change as we grow.
So as you grow, you might look for more independent people who would challenge you, perhaps not knowing you that well in the first place.
Possibly, or we might certainly have to come up with slightly different reporting structures and decision-making mechanisms. Obviously, again, at the moment, all directors have an equal vote. But yes, if we had a board of non-exec directors, I guess the idea would probably be that they would meet kind of monthly. For example, we as executive directors would report to them. We would tell them, how we're tracking on our mission, that we've set for ourselves month by month, and they would review that. And if they felt we weren't meeting that, then that would be their job to kind of hold us to account on that.
Good, thanks. Sarah, what does good challenge look like? I think sometimes we see trustees who are actually just cheerleaders for the staff. What does good challenge look like?
Well, there has to be a balance. I do think it's incredibly important when you go onto a board that you're not afraid to challenge, because that's your job. That's your job, to make sure that the money which goes into a charity is used effectively and appropriately. And so that challenge is absolutely key to ensure that the money gets to where it should get to. So asking questions and challenging is absolutely fundamental to the role of a trustee, but it's got to be done in a way which doesn't tip over into bullying or to be felt to be unhelpful. So there has to be support as well as challenge, and getting that balance right is quite difficult. And I know in the work that we do, quite often we find that staff will think that the challenge that they get from trustees is being critical and not being supportive, whereas trustees will think that they are just asking the right questions. And often, to make sure that you get that balance right, it's about having a clear understanding of each other's roles and what each other are doing. And you don't have to be sort of like a group together where everyone agrees with everything. In fact, that would be a terrible idea. If everyone just always agrees with everything, then a board isn't doing its job properly. It has to be there to challenge, but not in an aggressive way and not in a critical way, unless something is going badly wrong. You need to be able to challenge by asking the right questions and making sure that the information that is coming to you helps you to make really good decisions about how the money is used. So I think challenge and doing it effectively is about not doing it aggressively, but asking the right questions.
And maybe it's also about not getting into too much detail, the kind of asking strategic questions. And I think the menace of trustees who want to know how much money is being spent on tea and coffee is one that we're all familiar with, isn't it?
Yes, yes. I mean, and sort of when I said about people understanding each other's roles, you're right. That the trustees are there to be strategic, to hold the organisation to account, but they're not to be there to get into the detail of the operations if there are staff there whose job it is to do that. So there needs to be some clarity that the trustees aren't there to talk about how many toilet rolls there are in the toilets for the staff. They're there to think about the important questions about sort of what direction the charity should be going in, how can it best help people, what's coming up on the horizon, what's going to impact on people, and what does the charity need to do to make people's lives better. So they need to be thinking about the big questions and not interfering in the day-to-day operations. And part of that is just clarity of roles and making sure that when you actually delegate responsibilities to staff, you let them get on with it. As long as they report back to you as a board to tell you what they're doing, you have to have confidence that they will be doing what they're doing in terms of running the organisation, as long as you set the parameters within which they work.
Great. So I'm going to throw it open to the floor in a moment. But before we do that, one question for both of our speakers, and it's really to reflect on the particular circumstances of grassroots, refugee-focused organisations in the UK, and how well the framework that we've got works for that kind of organisation, and the particular challenges and perhaps opportunities that we see. Mona, I'll start with you, and Sarah can have the last word, drawing on her 15 years of experience at the Charity Commission.
Do you mean the legal frameworks in particular?
Yeah, the legal frameworks. Yeah, because people come from different countries. They're used to very different frameworks. The concept of charity actually is it's a largely British one.
Yeah, it is. And I grew up in Denmark, and we didn't really even have charities as such in that same way there as I discovered that we do here in the UK. And I think a lot of the young people we work with now have certainly learned that there seems to be all these organizations that are kind of there to help them in various ways, and they just kind of seek it, but I don't think they always fully understand. And I think in a lot of the countries they come from, there probably was a lot of community support, but it was probably quite fluid and not actually as an organizational registration. And so that's actually something that we are really trying to kind of manage as well. Like, especially in our case, we work with young refugees and asylum seekers who are mostly here as unaccompanied minors, so they are alone and they're deeply in need of community. And how do you give them that in a way that doesn't get too close? Like, what does it mean to be an organization that is supporting, that kind of wants to be on a fairly equal footing with the people that they support, and not blur certain lines of how you might do that and what that means in terms of safeguarding and so on. We do live in a very safeguarding kind of heavy country, and I think there are a lot of times where actually in practice, like as a youth worker or something, that you really probably actually should be, I don't know, working with the young person in a more compassionate and humane way than safeguarding would allow you to do, right? So I think there is some of that definitely isn't ideal all the time, and if you're not careful, you get really drowned in paperwork, and that takes away a lot of the time that you would be spending on delivery. And I guess if you mean very specifically about legal structures, then I guess it is something around the fact that if you do want organizations that are led by people with a more direct or lived experience of the issue, then obviously, yes, they would probably have less understanding and access to understanding that legal framework if they wanted to set something up. And we actually work quite closely with an organization called Darrow Youth Project in South London. And they literally grew out of the Eritrean sort of community of South London coming together and just hosting like dinners and stuff for younger, new Eritrean and Ethiopian arrivals, and just putting on food in a community center and stuff. And for a while that wasn't incorporated. And then as soon as they wanted to incorporate, they actually did specifically get a couple of sort of English, more local coordinators who literally, I think, understood the paperwork and the language and the processes better. And they were the people incorporating it, even though the whole organization and the volunteer base was all kind of older generation Eritrean people, not all of whom even spoke English that well. And I remember at the time they asked me to help them with some of that process because it was quite alien to them. So yes, I guess there probably is some barriers there. Is it more in this country than in any country if somebody wasn't from that country? I'm not sure, to be honest. I think it is just about whether you are plugged in and have that social capital and that knowledge and that language level compared to if you don't, essentially.
Great. Thank you, Mona. Sarah, what are your thoughts about the applicability of the framework?
Well, I think Mona's probably summed it up sort of beautifully. I mean, I think the concept of charity is, it is a sort of like perhaps seen as quite an old-fashioned kind of way of approaching things. And it is quite structured, and it does require a little bit of bureaucracy, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to sort of a more fluid sort of like approach to helping people, which I think sometimes when people are in crisis, you might need sort of something which is less sort of doesn't have those structures around it. So I do get that completely, and I'm not sort of here to defend the charitable sort of way charities are set up, but I do think some charities get around that quite well because they focus on the end user, and the sort of almost like the organization is set up, and it's set up in a way where there are people who are willing to do the sort of boring bits of the regulation and the legal side of things, but they also have people who understand and are from the community but are supported to be part of like the decision making. So it's not perfect, but some charities manage ways of making sure that they are set up by the people who they want to help, but perhaps with help from other people who understand the sort of boring sort of necessaries of the governance and the structures and the regulation, which is there. I mean, it's set up there to protect the funds and to make sure that they go in the right places, but it is quite a clunky kind of way of doing it. And then there may well be better ways of actually helping people. And I think someone put in the comments about sort of cooperatives, and there are different ways of setting things up, and charities aren't always going to be the best way. They have their advantages though, because they do tend to attract confidence, trust, and from that money from other people. Yeah,
very good. So I think this brings the kind of interview part of the session to a close. And so thank you very much, first of all, to Mona and Sarah for patiently answering my questions so well. So that was great.